Hi Norman, nice to speak to you. How are you?
Bit tired actually, but otherwise all right.
All right, well, we'll try and keep you awake as much as we can with incredible, fascinating, incisive questions for you to jump at. Well, I'm going to try. I suppose it might be best starting with the most topical royal-related story we've got today. And the news cycle's kind of embroiled in a mini race row after an incident that's been reported. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's one of the Queen's old friends who's 83 years old, who has been Lady Susan Hussey, who's been hanging around the palace for decades, no doubt, and said to this black woman the equivalent of, the Queen would say, "Have you come far?" Because that's what they asked you. So, she said something like, "Have you come? Which part of Africa are you from?" And of course, the woman is not from Africa. She's got British nationality. So that's the whole thing. I mean, look, she was just being clunky. Obviously, it was a deeply offensive comment for someone who is British. But she was just trying to make conversation the way that someone from the upper class who's been hidden away from society for decades and stuck in Buckingham Palace would do. That's the nub of it.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I suppose, not that we'd excuse that kind of thing, and we can definitely see how it's a problem, but do we need to be sort of a little... this has become a national news story. This has become a huge controversy. This has become the big example of British racism of the day.
Well, it's unintentional racism. Not that it makes it any better necessarily, but it's unintentional. She hasn't deliberately gone out to be offensive. She's just behaving as someone who's come from that generation in that class of society would behave. I think it's sensitive because obviously there was a deeply unhelpful, from the royal family's point of view, trip to the West Indies by William and Kate. When they replicated what would have happened 50 years ago with that kind of standing up in a jeep and having kids stuck behind a barbed wire fence and everything, which just looked terrible. And I think William in particular is very sensitive to that as a consequence of how that came across. And of course, as I set out in my book, there's plenty of examples of racism in the royal family, not particularly from the Queen, but there was certainly plenty from Prince Philip and the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother was very racist. Even the extent of turning to her guests next to her at dinner and saying, out of nowhere, "Beware the blackamoors." It's clearly, and going into a room with the Japanese and saying "Nippon, Nippon." Just appalling. That's that generation in a way. And I think William and Kate are probably sensitive to it, and that's why he said something today about it. But it's just an old woman who's in a privileged society who didn't know any better and said something she shouldn't have said. I can't get too excited about it. I'm very sorry that she said it, and it's offensive to the person who was said to, but it wasn't. I don't think, intentional.
Yeah, it's also worth noticing, she's apologised. She's been made to resign in the book. The palace has released an official statement condemning and apologising for it, which is, really, in a just world, should probably signal the end of the so-called controversy.
There's a lot worse goes on than that, to be honest with you.
What do you think the British public relationship's going to be with this new sort of format of monarchy going forward? Because it always seemed to me that the Queen did a great job of remaining almost politically neutral, as far as I could see. It was very difficult to pin her down on political issues, whereas people like Charles are incredibly vocal. They've gone on record numerous times. And obviously, the younger royals seem very caught up in this idea of activism and social justice. Is that going to be a big problem for the palace going forward?
Well, look, you've got to bear in mind that when the Queen came to the throne in 1952, nobody knew her views on anything because she hadn't been the heir to the throne for very long, point one. Second, there was no television. There wasn't really much radio. And there was a huge kind of respect and unwillingness of the media to go anywhere near their private views. Bear in mind that when the Queen came to the throne, a quarter of the British public, when polled, thought that she would be put there by God. The girls who held her train in the Abbey had to be virgin daughters of dukes. Members of the military who were there to attend the coronation had been told to abstain from sex for 48 hours before the coronation, or how anyone checked up on that, I'm not quite sure. And then you had the fact that nobody who was divorced was allowed to be in the presence of the Queen. Just well, that changed given what happened with their family. So the situation changed dramatically, and therefore there was no history of the Queen's views in 52. She then kept her lip buttoned up while she was monarch, largely. Although we do find a bit about what she thinks from others rather than from her. But I mean, Charles is a different kettle of fish. He's been there, drumming his fingers, really waiting for the throne for however many years it was, 70 years or something, enormous amount of time, 60 years or so. I can't remember how many long it is now. But I mean, he was, and during that time, I mean, his views known on a whole range of issues, from homeopathy to architecture to being in favour of hunting and everything else. So he's already got on the record a whole range of his views, which some of which are quite controversial. I tend to agree with all he says, as a matter of fact, but I take the view of Voltaire in reverse. Voltaire said, "I disagree with what you say, but I agree with your right to say it." I'm the reverse with Prince Charles. I agree with what you said, but I think you should shut up. And he doesn't, and you can't have a monarch with a view, with a political view, is a politician, not a monarch.
Albeit an unelected one, I suppose.
Well, I mean, that goes down the heart of it. I mean, of course, they're unelected, same as the House of Lords. I remember back in about 2002 or thereabouts, when, or might be slightly earlier, when Tony Blair's government was proposing to get rid of the hereditary peers in the House of Lords, which I agree with, by the way. And I remember the Queen's speech that year, the Queen standing up in there, or sitting down for the Queen's speech, and reading out the Queen's speech saying, "My government will abolish the hereditary principle," and obviously thinking, hang on, that's not right.
How do we feel about the role of the royals in everyday British public's life? Because it seemed to me like, just from a personal anecdotal perspective, that they felt like they were sort of drifting into a sort of irrelevance, like a relic of a past time. And then obviously during lockdown, the Queen gave this wonderfully rousing speech, it became known as the "We'll Meet Again" speech. And that seemed to lift and inspire a lot of people and sort of reignited this question about our national identity. What does it mean to be British? What represents us? What would fill the void if monarchy was abolished? That kind of thing. Where do you think monarchy are in that sense?
Well, look, I mean, let's be quite clear that, generally speaking, any speech made by the monarch is one that's been written for her by the Prime Minister's office or by the Foreign Secretary or wherever it happens to be. That's a constitutional position, that they read out what they're told to read out. I suppose there's some flexibility, but the Queen, for example, spoke a few words in Irish, Gaelic, when she went over to Dublin, which made a big impact on the Irish and was actually a very good thing to do. I don't suppose that was her idea. I suppose that was some idea of the Foreign Office who thought it was appropriate, A, that she should go, and B, she should say that. So, they don't actually create these things themselves largely, or at least they don't do when they're on the throne. I mean, Prince Charles was creating his own, going through his own process before he was king. I think that, the royal family is regarded by many people as sort of a symbol of something we should be proud of in Britain. And I don't want to disparage that. That's not my view personally, but a lot of people think that. My view is, and I'm not blaming them for this necessarily, my view is that they actually hold the country back, because they perpetrate the image that Britain is a kind of world power, that we're still there. We've still got gunboats running around the world, that people, we're the last country with an imperial monarchy. And actually, I think that stops us moving on. It stops us realizing that we're no longer a world power. We haven't got Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt sitting around the table deciding what's happening to the world. We're just a nice medium-sized European power, like my country, but we're not a world power. Let's stop pretending we are. We got a big shock in Suez in 1956. We still haven't learned from that. 60 years, 65 years on. And, that's what Brexit was about. Brexit was about pretending Britain could go along. What a disaster that's been, looking at all the consequences of that in 2016. So, the royal family holds us back in that sense. And I don't really think that it's very appropriate or helpful for us. The American media presents Britain as a kind of real life, Disney thing with kind of castles and princesses. I mean, I don't think that's our image. It shouldn't be anyway.
Well, talking of the tabloids, one of the things they really enjoyed doing these last few years was sort of making out this idea that there's some huge rivalry between like Meghan Markle, Kate Middleton, as if there was some friction there. And maybe that's true, maybe that isn't. But I believe there's some reasons to suggest that they may actually be conversing on a podcast for Spotify. Is there any truth to this?
Well, I don't know if there's any truth or not, but I'd be slightly surprised if there is, because they have been. It's been a difficult relationship. But look, I mean, the media always likes to, the tabloid media likes to have battles going on. They like battles between royal women. I mean, I don't know why they want that, but they do. So the same thing happened with Diana and Fergie back in the 1990s. A kind of good cop, bad cop thing. And you have to have somebody who's up and somebody who's down. And Meghan's clearly in everybody's bad books at the moment, not least of all because she has successfully sued the Mail Group, which is obviously going to antagonize them, and also because some people think she's taken Harry away from his royal duties, etc., into California to become a bit woke. Again, I'm quoting the papers rather than my view on that. But I think there's a general tendency in the royal family, which is reflected in some of the tabloids, that they don't like powerful women. When we had Diana, who definitely had a mind of her own and wasn't afraid to express it, and was the first royal to shake hands with someone with HIV, who campaigned against landmines and so on. I mean, that was not regarded as popular. Charles himself, who was married to her, although he was having an affair with Camilla from day one, Charles was complaining that she was more popular than him. Diana was told she had to say nothing and simper when her husband went on a walkabout. That was what she was told to do. She said barely anything for the first 3 or 4 years before she got fed up with it. And that's what the role. And therefore, when Meghan came on the scene, she was told, cross your legs, wear dull colours, wear grey, don't wear that, don't do this. And she's an American woman who's been used to a different situation. And she campaigned for changes to adverts, for example, when women were portrayed in a kind of traditional 1950s way. So she was never going to shut up. And actually, the royal family would have been better to have embraced that as part of modernity rather than trying to shut it down as if nothing had happened.
Yeah, like I think you alluded to, I think she may have had this vision of a sort of very free Disney-esque existence as this beautiful English princess, and obviously it's very restrictive rules, do's and don'ts. I can imagine it being quite suffocating. I suppose as well the tabloids and much of the commentary on Meghan Markle's exit focused on this idea of societal racism and institutional racism, and it's difficult to know. I suppose a lot of people just maintain the fact they found her rather dislikable, and then obviously other people will say, well, it was definitely a racist thing. How do you gauge something like that in your opinion?
I don't particularly think it was racist. I think a bit like Lady Susan Hussey, where we started the conversation today, I think that those who are kind of in the ivory tower of Buckingham Palace, if that's not a contradiction in terms, actually find they are divorced from reality. They don't walk down the street in Leicester and see black people or Asian people. They just don't see them. They're not around, and they're not in their world. And I think they find it very difficult to deal with it, and therefore they end up trying to be kind, but actually being patronising. And that's when people object. I mean, the attitude is, we are being nice to these people from the empire. That's kind of the mindset. And they find it difficult to realise that that's not where they should be. So, I don't think I don't personally believe there was very much deliberate racism, but I think there was quite a lot of indirect, unintentional racism. And Meghan will have picked that up. I mean, the situation in America is a bit different. I mean, there was racism there of a different sort in America to what we have over here. I'm not saying it's any better or any worse, but I mean, we don't go around shooting black people walking down the street like they do in America. But, there's a racism of a different sort over here.
Yeah, different histories for sure when it comes to racial division. How much damage has Prince Andrew done to the royal family? Can he ever sort of scrape back some sort of public life now, do you think?
No, he won't. And he won't because he has completely damaged goods. He's damaged himself. And the thing about Andrew is he's a deeply unpleasant person, in my view. He's a boor. He's a bully. He's not very intelligent. And he's continually rude to people. So there was nobody there to defend him when all this happened, because there was nobody who said, well, Andrew's a good guy. They all said, well, he's going to get his comeuppance. That's what people thought. So he's brought it on himself. And Charles, I think, is sensible enough to know that if he tries to bring Andrew back, then that will be open season on the royals. So he's finished, and so he should be. I should say, by the way, Stephen, it would be wrong of me not to say so. All the details of Andrew's proclivities you can find in my book, which is called "And What Do You Do?" But the serious point about Andrew is that I seriously believe this, the worst has not come out about Andrew, because it's not simply all his stuff about Epstein, which has been covered in the press, which is shocking enough. It's his finances. That's where the press ought to be going, his finances, and the way he used his position as trade envoy to enrich himself and damage this country abroad. That's what I want to have exposed. It's in my book, a lot of it. But I mean, for example, why was he able to buy a ski chalet in Switzerland on the basis of £249,000 a year from the Queen and £20,000 a year naval pension when the chalet cost about £13 million? Where did that come from? I think we ought to know about it.
That's a good question. Talking of people who are generally considered good with money or not, depending on where you're coming from, how do you think Rishi's doing, our new PM? It's been a very turbulent time for our government. Tories in particular, with a revolving door of leaderships. They ousted their election winner. Whether you believe that was a good thing or a bad thing, it seems like people that they are putting in charge now may have less ability to win elections. How are you measuring his success in this role in the early days so far?
Well, look, I'm a Lib Dem, but I'm not going to give you a party view. I'm going to try and give you an objective view on this. Because I've worked with Tories and Labour people who I've got a lot of time for, and I'll say so. And I think there were some Tory politicians I can think of when I was working in the coalition who I thought were pretty good. People like Patrick McLaughlin, the Transport Secretary, who I would defend as being a really nice guy. But what's happened since then? Well, we had Theresa May, who was David Cameron, who was just privileged and thought he ought to be there because he'd been to Eton and it was his right to be Prime Minister. We then had Theresa May, who actually was honest and wanted to do the best for the country, but hopelessly out of her depth and very two-dimensional. Dad was a vicar, you never got over her, I don't think, because she still had that kind of narrow Church of England view, which is kind of just rubbish when you're trying to run the country. We then had Boris Johnson, and you wanted Theresa back almost, because Boris Johnson, I think, is deeply narcissistic. He is the British version of Donald Trump. He was only interested in himself, and he wasn't very good at being Prime Minister. He was kind of very affable and entertaining, but beneath that, I think, was quite a nasty person. So I didn't like Boris Johnson at all. I dealt with him when I was Minister of Transport. I didn't like him then. I don't like him now. You then had Liz Truss, who was just bonkers, and kind of mad and lost. What did she lose? Something like 60 billion in a couple of weeks or something for the country. I mean, just an extraordinary amount of money she's lost through her crazy behaviour. Thank God she's gone. And then you have Rishi Sunak. Now, so how's Rishi Sunak doing, your question? Well, he's not Boris Johnson, he's not Liz Truss, so thank God that's an improvement, is my first reaction, because he's actually, within his own terms, reasonably competent and reasonably sensible. I don't actually agree with his policy necessarily, but I think at least he gives the image that he might be a prime minister who looks like a prime minister to some degree, which the last one didn't. Look, I mean, the trouble with Rishi Sunak is the same problem that John Major had in 1992, just 97, that period up to the 97 election, which is he's got a party that's completely riven down the middle. Actually, on the same divide it was then between European maniacs and kind of vaguely sensible people in the middle. You've also got a party, a Tory party, that thinks he's going to lose the next election. And they're all standing down, not fighting their seats. And if they're all standing down, you think, well, we may as well have some fun while I'm here. I'm going to say what I think. I'm going to vaguely, and therefore they'll come out and vote how they want. Others are going to think, well, I definitely want to save my seat, so I'm going to vote against the party and say something controversial to get myself in the headlines. He's got an uncontrollable party. Party discipline is broken down. So in a way, it doesn't matter how good he is. He's not going to control the Conservative Party. They're going to run in 100 different directions.
Yeah, I mean, Boris is an interesting phenomenon, and you used the word affable there to describe him. And for all his shortcomings, of which there are many, he does seem remarkably popular with the British electorate. And so how without insulting the electorate, how do we explain the rise of someone like Boris to the top job in the land?
Here's a controversial view, I suppose. If you have an education at Eton, you learn how to present yourself. You learn how to present yourself in society and get on. You know the right connections. You know which buttons to press and which levers to pull to be successful. You know the right people. Now, sometimes people who've been to Eton will use that in a beneficial way to benefit others. But you can also, if you are so minded, and that's your personality, use it to create an image which is convincing, but actually there's something rather nasty underneath. And I'm afraid that's how I see Boris. So he was here to, you know, on a superficial level, he looks, you know, an interesting guy, affable, someone you have a pint with down the pub. And that's what came across to many people. And why would you go any deeper? All I would say to you is, and this is my experience, it's just the experience of others, is the more you know Boris Johnson, the less you trust him.
I think I've heard that before from various other people as well. So, I mean, just circling back to the royals a little bit, there was a lot of discussion over how much it would cost to provide security for Meghan and Harry. Now they are no longer sort of a part of the official inner circle, and who would fund that. And I think that felt like a rather distasteful prospect for the British taxpayer to be part of. And But there's been some credible reports that they actually faced some sincere threats to themselves when travelling, haven't they?
Well, look, I mean, you start from the principle that if you are a public figure who is performing a public role and there's a danger to your safety, potentially, not even identified, but potentially, and you're significantly senior, then you are provided with security. So I've no doubt whatsoever, well, I know it's the case, that there'll be security for the Home Secretary, there'll be security for the Prime Minister, and others who may be targets for terrorism. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly proper that we should protect those people. The security for Charles and for William, because they are targets that people would like to, some people who have got terrorist inclinations would like to attack and not bump off. But then a secondary group of people who are not public figures and who have no public role. And that now includes Harry and Meghan, who are not members of the royal family for the purpose of undertaking public activities. It also includes people like David Beckham, for example, or I don't know, Gary Lineker. I mean, people who are known in the public eye who do things. Now, if there was a credible threat against Gary Lineker or David Beckham, would we expect the taxpayer to pay a huge amount of money to protect them? You might do if the threat was imminent and very serious and very immediate. Then there'd be some protection, perhaps, as it would be for you or me in that situation. But it wouldn't be general 24-hour coverage, which is what Charles or the Prime Minister or the Home Secretary gets. And I don't know how serious the threat is to Harry, if there is a threat to Harry, but if it comes into that immediate, serious category I've just described, then I'd be happy for him to have some protection. But if it doesn't come into that, then he can pay for it like David Beckham or Gary Lineker does.
Yeah, it's an expensive bill, that, isn't it, as well? I suppose I'm really fascinated with this idea of national identity at the moment and what it means to be British and what unites us and what kind of emblems we can look to and rally around. And my Republican instincts remain intact, but I've become very uneasy about the question of what would replace monarchy if we abolished it. Would we even need a replacement, and what that would do to the national psyche to not have it? And I'm just wondering, have you any thoughts on what a post-monarchist UK would look like?
Well, I mean, there are three options, Stephen. I mean, the first option is what we got at the moment, which is an imperial monarchy. We are the last imperial monarchy in Europe. The rest have all gone. The German Kaiser, the Austrian Emperor, the French Emperor, the Russian Tsar, they've all gone. And what we're left with in Europe are modern monarchies, like the Belgians and the Dutch and the Swedish and the Norwegians and the Danes, or the imperial monarchy we've got. So there are three choices. One, we can carry on with all the damage I think that does, and the unfairness, and I can go into why it's all unfair, not least of all in tax reasons. Or we have a modern monarchy, like they do in other European countries, which are much, much cheaper, incredibly cheaper, and where the royal family behaves like normal people, believe it or not. And I can give you some examples of that. No, they do. I mean, I was in Sweden, and I was in this reception. I got chatting to this woman in the corner of the room, and 5 minutes into the conversation, I found out she was a Swedish princess. There's no way you have that sort of informality in this country with members of the royal family. You're supposed to line up and queue up and bow and scrape. I mean, that's how it is, though. So the second option is a modern monarchy. And I suspect that's where the British public is, by the way, if you ask them. And the third option is a republic. Well, there are plenty of republics around the world. We got on fine. The Irish have a republic, and they've had a couple of presidents who've been very effective on the world stage. So, people say, well, we don't want Tony Blair as president. Well, neither do I, but nobody will vote for Tony Blair as president, so it ain't going to happen. There's nothing wrong with voting for people. Why should you not be able to vote for why should it be that the head of state is the only person you can't vote for, as a public figure in that way? I don't think that's right. You can't aspire to be head of state. You should be able to do that in democracy, in my view, but you can't do it over here. So, why not have a president? And also, a key question that Tom Paine asked, I'm speaking to you from Lewis. Tom Paine, the great revolutionary, lived in Lewis, wrote The Rights of Man and everything else down here. He said, how can we get rid of you? That's a question to ask anybody who exercises power. How can we get rid of you? And you can't get rid of the royal family. You can't get rid of Prince Andrew. He's there. You can get rid of the Prime Minister. You can get rid of the leader of opposition. You can't get rid of Prince Andrew or the royal family. So I think there is a strong case for a republic. But personally, I could live with if we ended up with a European monarchy which cost nothing, next to nothing. Then I could probably live with that as well.
Yeah, no, that's a very comprehensive answer, and I actually found myself nodding along with all of that. So I suppose this isn't an ethical argument, and just to play sort of devil's advocate, you said there with us being unique in our sort of airs and graces and our traditions, if you will. Now, isn't that considered by some to be the strength when you can call upon an age-old tradition? If you sort of look towards the Queen's funeral, for instance, and how regimented that was, and how basically that's the only place something like that could happen in the world, there is a sort of sense of national pride about things like tradition in that sense.
Yeah, there is, but a national pride from something that's been there a long time exists. And, in a way, you can say Stonehenge has been there a long time, but I'm quite proud that we got Stonehenge in this country. But I wouldn't, something doesn't change is also fossilizing matters, and the world's changed around it, the country's changed around it. And I think that it's interesting to think about the national anthem. The national anthem used to be hugely respectable. Even when I was a young kid, the national anthem was being played at the end of films and cinemas. Well, it was like a fire alarm, because people kind of rushed to get out of the cinema before the national anthem finished. And it was so embarrassing, they dropped it from there. But the national anthem, this is what's wrong, in microcosm, what's wrong with the country. Every other country's national anthem is one that everybody can agree with, Canada, oh Canada, or there's something rousing like the Marseillaise in France. They're all about a unifying factor. National anthem should be a unifying factor. For our national anthem is the only one I know which personalizes it to one person, namely the king now, or the queen as it was. The only one I know that does that. Also, to add in, you've got to believe in God, which not everybody does. So, you've got to A, believe in God, and B, support the king. Otherwise, the national anthem's not for you. Well, national anthem should be a unifying thing, not a divisive thing. And that's the sort of thing that hasn't changed over the years and really ought to change. So we need to change all that really and modernize matters wherever we go. That needs to happen.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, obviously, how does it feel for you to be under a king now? Is that a significant difference? Is it more of the same? Because obviously we've been born completely under tenure of a queen, and the queen's died, and now it's the king. I mean, I've noticed it's catching out sports stars when singing the national anthem, actually. But I mean, is it a significant change in any sense?
Well, it is in a couple of senses. By the way, just talking about what unifies a country, I'll tell you what unifies a country at the moment is football team. That's what unifies a country. Or if you live in Liverpool, it's Liverpool or Everton or whatever it happens to be. You unify by sport. That's a great unifier more than almost anything else. That's in a way for the population at large has replaced the royal family as a unifying factor, I think. But has it changed with Charles? Well, of course it has, because there was a respect, if you like, for the Queen, which was partly she created herself, to be fair to her, through her actions, but also because there was a kind of unwillingness from the press to go near anything controversial to do with her. And you could find things controversial if you wanted to, particularly Prince Philip, I might say, but they wanted not to go near those things. So there was an image created which nobody wanted to disturb. Charles is a different matter. Charles, first of all, the press feel a bit freer to go after him. Secondly, he's got a whole lot of stuff on the record which has to be defended or denied or whatever. And thirdly, there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the royal family which isn't terribly attractive, whether it's Harry and Meghan or Andrew, or a whole lot of stuff that hasn't yet come out about royal finances, which are in my book, which really I think is the Achilles heel for the royal family. When people realise just how much we're paying for them, and all the tricks they have to avoid paying tax and everything, I think people will be horrified. So I think they're in some danger. So my advice to Charles, I don't think you'll take any advice from me. My advice to Charles is you better modernise your thing pretty damn quick. Otherwise, you're building up trouble for yourself. You can't keep putting a lid on things and hoping no one will notice.
Okay, so I want to touch on this idea of class a little bit as well, because to me, coming from sort of the working class left, the royals kind of represent everything the working class left is in opposition to, hereditary power, privilege and wealth and nepotism, things like that. However, I am in sort of working class North Manchester, surrounded by working class people who love the monarchy, including my brother and my partner. It's the cause of many disagreements in my household, in fact. So how is it that the working class seemingly can be big advocates for something that you would think would not be in their interest to be advocates for at all?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Stephen. I think that it reminds me of an interview that was carried out on Skid Row in California, with some poor bloke living in a kind of cardboard box, who was asked his political views. He said, I support George Bush, or he was at the time, Republican. And he said, why on earth are you supporting George Bush living here on the street? He said, because I might be rich one day, was his answer. And I think I'm not saying that's the whole explanation, but there certainly is a kind of aspirational thing. People used to say, you get working class people voting Tory because they thought it brought them up the social ladder. It didn't, of course, but that's what they thought. So there's an element of that. There's also the fact that the royal image has been carefully honed to present something which is attractive, and where the negatives are kind of excluded. In my book, I go on about the box of royal tricks, which is about how they control the media. It's nonsense to say they can't answer back, by the way. They control the media a great deal behind the scenes. How they control the media, how they resort to legal action to shut people up, how they make sure that those who are favourable are given special treatment, and those who aren't are somehow put on the sidelines. All those things happen. To give you an example of the manipulation of the media, we know about this because the paper didn't cave in on this particular occasion. Charles was out shooting at Sandringham. Not an image they want to see. They go shooting a lot, as Andrew so famously said in his BBC interview, in normal shooting weekends. They go shooting a lot. But of course, they don't want to show that because that's not something which is popular with the population at large, including, I guess, your guys in Manchester. So they don't want to show that. But anyway, on this particular occasion, when he was out shooting, someone took a photograph of him. And he then phoned the police and wanted this guy's camera taken away and the photograph destroyed. And the police came along, and with due respect to the police and well done to them actually on this occasion, they said to Charles, the guy's on a public footpath. He's entitled to take a photograph from a public footpath. Nothing you can do about it. So Charles then didn't let it go. He then got his lawyers involved, expensive lawyers, we may have paid for, by the way. You know, expensive lawyers involved, because the guy had said, I had enough of this, I'm going to sell it to the papers. How dare you interfere with my photograph? So it ended up with the lawyers contacting the Mail on Sunday, which is the paper the guy went to, and saying, we don't, you must not publish this photograph. It's an invasion of privacy or some other nonsense like that. And the Mail on Sunday said, get lost. Good for them. And it's published not just a photograph, but the whole story, which is why we know about it. But that's the sort of thing they do. That's a lens they go to protect their image.
We've run out of time, Norman. Do you want to tell the viewers where they can find you, support you, and get how do you do?
Right, what do you do? Well, yes, they can get my book, which is in paperback. That are 43 rolls, 44 on the balcony. Who are they, or why are we paying for them? Or they can get them somewhere. They get the hardback. The paperback's more up to date. It was updated to take account of Andrew and everybody else. Harry and Meghan came out a couple of years ago. It's available from all good bookshops and some bad ones too, and from Amazon, no doubt, and all sorts of other non-tax-paying organisations.
All right, thanks for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Norman.
Ta-da.
Cheers.